Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Off the Charts Football Podcast, the Super Bowl edition. I'm your host today, Scott Spratt from Sports Info Solutions. I'm joined, as always, by Schatz of Football Outsiders. Before we get started, I want to remind everyone that the Off the Charts Football Podcast is presented to you by FantasyInsiders.com, your source for daily fantasy sports content. Their slogan is Accuracy Matters, and it shows since they've won the Daily Fantasy Accuracy Competition for the past 3 years. If you're serious about DFS or want to become serious, check out FantasyInsiders.com for free educational content and premium memberships. Aaron, today's show, it's definitely going to be all about the Panthers and Broncos, the Super Bowl showdown coming up this Sunday. And I think we're going to spend a little bit of time going over some of the championship games that we haven't talked about yet, but we wanted to focus primarily on what some of the upcoming matchup-specific things were that we wanted to talk about with the Panthers and Broncos.
And you know what? Before we get into the stats,
yes,
I want to play host and let you answer the question.
Okay.
For people who have been listening to the podcast all year, they know that this has been the meeting of the minds of fans of two of this year's top teams. My boys lost last week.
That was devastating.
Well, you know what? It was not as devastating, I think, as it could have been. Obviously, I come at this somewhat from the analytical perspective of always understanding probabilities. I went into the AFC Championship game believing that Denver was better than people gave them credit for. I think as a fan, I would rather have my team lose by not making it at the end, by trying valiantly and falling short, than by blowing the lead.
I completely agree with that.
But you're in a different position because as a Carolina Panthers fan, you are not used to a decade of constant success. Although Carolina has been one of the more successful teams in the league over the last few years, especially in the NFC. I don't think people realize that Carolina's had more success than most of the other teams in the NFC over the last 12 years or so, even over the last 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, I tried to be an advocate before this year that the Panthers were a little bit better than people thought, especially compared to some of the other NFC South teams, to be clear.
So how does it feel for you as a, not long-suffering Panthers fan? It's hard to say long-suffering for a team that's only existed for 20 years. But how does it feel to be back in the Super Bowl, to have your team favored, the first chance to have the first ring for the Panthers, the first championship for a team based in Charlotte, and then for a professional team, to have destroyed your competition in the conference championship game?
Well, I mean, I've enjoyed sort of the turning of people's minds that weren't buying into the Panthers, and we're going to talk a little bit about that during the show today. It's been fun to sort of be that underdog and succeed and continue to succeed. But now that we're there and now that the Panthers are the favored team and expected to win, it's a level of anxiety that I'm frankly just not used to. When the Panthers made it to the Super Bowl early in the 2000s, that entire run was shocking to every Panther fan. That team didn't feel like it belonged necessarily. But then it went on and had a great Super Bowl. And even though they lost to the Patriots, it felt like a victory that season had ended so well, that they had overachieved so much. Now I'm just totally anxious that I feel like if the Panthers don't beat the Broncos, it would be like an upset, and it would be sort of a failure, like you mentioned with the Patriots, that it didn't like cap off a season. It's more of like they gave it away. So I'm definitely super nervous at this point.
Yeah, and it's a tough feeling to have because, look, the fact is, looking at it from the outside, we always have to acknowledge if your team makes the Final Four, that's a successful season. No matter how good you were in the past, right?
Yes.
You can't have an expectation of making it past the Final Four. No, even the best teams, your expectation should be to make the Final Four. That's a successful season. For teams that were worse in the past, right, you can define success in different ways. I mean, I think that this season was a successful season for the Oakland Raiders, even though they only finished 7-9, because it seems like they have hope now. But, even for the top teams, I'm not a believer in Super Bowl or bust. And I think that in the long run, it will feel to you like it felt to Patriots fans more in 2011. The frustration of losing in the Super Bowl, I mean, if they lose, the frustration of losing in the Super Bowl, but then you acknowledge you did have a really good season and there was a lot of joy, that your team brought you a lot of joy. 2007 was a bit of a different beast.
Sure.
But for the most part, I mean, I understand that anxiety because I felt that anxiety as a Patriots fan. And it's tough because you're going into this game and you know Denver's good, but you know Carolina's better, and they are better.
Well, one side of the coin is sort of the Patriots route, where you guys have had some bad losses, not bad necessarily, but I'm sure very upsetting as fans, losses in big spots like that, but you've continued to sustain success. What I would be afraid of is if the Panthers lost this game, what if they went sort of the route of the Oklahoma City Thunder, where you have this young team with an emerging star in Cam Newton? What happens if you aren't getting back? Like 10 years from now, if that didn't happen, and obviously it's really hard to get back, that would sort of paint a different light on that sort of upset.
Yeah, and it's tough. Most teams don't get back to that championship game, but Oklahoma City was a weird case because Carolina, a lot of times if a team makes the championship game and then doesn't make it back, either it's an aged team where that's kind of like the last gasp,
right,
like the Oakland Raiders of 2002, or it's the surprise team, like the Panthers in 2003, like the Ravens in 2012. But Carolina is a team that has amassed young talent, and when Oklahoma City hasn't made it back in the NBA, that was a weird thing. When the Chicago Cubs had Pryor and Wood, and they failed in the NLCS, and then they never really made it back. That was like they had all that young talent, and then they was going to turn into something great, and it didn't. And I think it would be the same thing with Carolina. But the flip of that is, I don't think that's very likely. I think that it's much more likely that Carolina is now successful for the next 3 or 4 years. Even they may never make it to this final game. But, even San Francisco, I guess, disintegrated, but at least they were still really good with all that young talent for a year or two. And the odds that everybody in Carolina is going to retire is pretty small.
One hopes.
So on to the game and the fact, let's talk about what Carolina needs to do to win, what Denver needs to do for the upset, because Carolina is the better team. And, for all that the stats for early in the year talked about Carolina as not being the best of the undefeated teams early on, the Panthers have improved in the second half of the season significantly to where they are now playing at that level that is commensurate with their record.
Yeah, and I think your DVOA column that detailed through the championship game weeks that you posted last week really illustrated this point very nicely in one graphic, which showed that from weeks 1 to 9, when the Panthers were 8-0, they had just one win by 14 or more points. And since week 10, and including through the playoffs so far, they have 6 wins by 14 or more points. I think it sort of clearly shows that, yes, they were probably luckier in the early half of this season, but rather than sort of regress back to the level of play with the record, they sort of brought their play up to match that sort of record. And so that's sort of why the sabermetric stats have not loved the Panthers as much until recently, when they've accumulated those bigger and bigger wins.
Right, but it's been gradual. But at this point, it matches how well they're playing matches their record. Even if we say, okay, well, let's not only look at the last half of the season. Let's look at the full season.
Right.
Okay, well, if we look at the full season, including the playoffs, they still are the best, pretty much the best team in the league. Or maybe tied with Seattle, because Seattle was so good in the second half of the year. So it's not like, if you look at the full season, they're that good. If you look at just the second half of the season, they're really that good. I think during the season, what I said was Carolina's not playing like a team that's going to go 16-0. They're playing like a team that should be 12-14, but that still ends up being one of the best teams in the league and a Super Bowl contender. Now I'd say Carolina wasn't really a team that was, usually as good as a 15-1 team this year. They're more like a 13-3 or 14-2 team, the kind of team that's the leading Super Bowl contender, and that's what they are.
Right.
And the offense is what's gotten better. Let's make it clear. Special teams became average, but the real change is the offense was better. Cam Newton has been better as a passer, more accurate, fewer interceptions, higher completion rate, even on downfield passes in the second half of the year. That's where the biggest improvement has been.
Of course, a couple of weeks ago, we were talking about how much better the Patriots were than the Broncos. Maybe not us specifically, because actually I recall you making the case for the Broncos pretty presciently. But the Broncos definitely were able to stop the Patriots from scoring on offense, which is something they hadn't had a lot of trouble with through this season. And a lot of that was because of pressure. They got to Brady constantly and quickly, and they forced him to make bad decisions. On the year, the Broncos had generated 218 pressures and sacks. That was the third most in football. They had 30 against the Patriots in the championship game. That was tied for the third most of any game all year of any team. So they clearly were able to take advantage there. And what I want to kind of do now, Aaron, is compare and contrast the Patriots and Panthers, because I feel like they are two very different challenges for a defense to face, and whether the differences there might help the Panthers have some success scoring against the stout Broncos defense.
Yeah, I think that a lot of it has to do when we talk about the pressure. The big difference in this game is going to be where the pressure comes from. And I think Wade Phillips is smart enough to change up his strategy. Now, if he's smart, he'll continue the strategy from the AFC Championship game of not blitzing much. Because as we've talked about on previous podcasts, Cam Newton was one of, if not the best quarterback in the league this year against the blitz when you compare it to his numbers otherwise. And especially blitzing opens up things because you usually have to play man coverage behind that. Really opens up for the Cam Newton scrambles. Yes. But even when they just bring four guys, with the Patriots, the real weakness was the interior line. They stunted a ton to get Miller and Ware in there on the interior. Carolina, the weakness is the outside of the line. You don't want to stunt and try to take down Khalil and Trey Turner. You want to go outside and try to take down Michael Orr and Michael Remmers. So I would expect more conventional pass rushes in this game.
And just looking at it a little bit more generally, I mean, we knew about the Patriots were having trouble with the offensive line because of injuries, and that really bore out with the numbers. At the beginning of the regular season, when they had their healthy line, including Nate Salter, they allowed 10 pressures against Brady per game, and that jumped to 12.5 without him. And just overall, the Panthers have been more successful in pass protection this year, allowing only 163 total pressures and sacks. That's about 30 fewer than the Patriots. But keep in mind, too, that a lot of that is about the run-pass balance and the fact that the Panthers just run the ball so much. And I actually feel like the Panthers' best chance of avoiding catastrophic pressure is going to be running the ball. Do you think that can actually be successful against the Broncos that completely shut down the Patriots' running attack?
Well, I will say that I don't believe that straight-ahead runs tend to stop pass pressure because, you know, if you're under center and the defense is going to play you kind of, you know, you're Carolina, they're kind of expecting the run. You know, I don't know how much of an impact that really has. And Denver is a really strong run defense. They were fourth in DVOA against the run this year, so it's not like they're, you know, imbalanced. They're first against the pass, fourth against the run. I think that what might be complicated for them would be the zone read and option stuff, and I mean that's part of the power of Newton. It's one of the things that you don't see in his stats is the way the option and read option and things like that opens up lanes for running for the running backs, as well as, you know, sometimes for wide receivers coming around on end arounds and whatnot. And I do think that might be a little tough for Denver because they're going to have to watch for all that stuff that they certainly did not need to watch for last week. The other thing I'll say about the Panthers and their offense is that the SIS charting numbers showed that Carolina was number 2 this year in percentage of pass plays that used 7-man protection. So they are not afraid to leave in backs or tight ends, usually Ed Dixon, I would guess, instead of Greg Olsen. As far, you know, they'll go 2 tight ends. Sure. Olsen will go on a route. Dixon will stay to block. Running back will block. They're not afraid to protect Cam when he wants to go deep. And that makes it harder for the Broncos to get there with pressure. Now, obviously, if they send 4 and you block with 7, you leave them with 7 to cover 3. But receivers do get open sometimes, and also Cam, if nobody's open, boop, 6 yards high. Okay, now it's 2nd and 4, so, you know.
Yeah, that's really the saving grace of the Panthers' offense and why they're so dangerous on 3rd down and in goal line situations, because you don't really need an open receiver necessarily to create a productive play for the team. You kind of mentioned about going downfield a little bit there, and that's an interesting place where the Panthers and Patriots differ a lot in their strategies, and this could kind of come into play in a couple of ways against the Broncos. But just as sort of a comparison from this season, Tom Brady threw the ball 10 or more yards down the field only 28% of the time, while Cam Newton threw it 10 or more yards down the field 44% of the time. Huge difference there. Couple of questions there related to that. One, how do the Broncos fare on deeper passes relative to shorter passes? And then does that just create more time for the pass pressure to wreak havoc on Newton?
Well, not if they leave in all of those blockers. That's
sure,
the thing.
That's really the key. Okay.
Denver and Carolina were the top 2 pass defenses this year against short passes, so everything 15 yards away from the line of scrimmage and in. Denver was 7th against the deep pass. Carolina was 5th. So, yes, Denver both defenses are better against the short pass than the deep pass, but they're both pretty good against the deep pass too. And by the way, this is sort of one of the unspoken things about this game is, as great as the Denver defense is, the Carolina defense is also pretty good. So
it's true.
But yeah, the difference, I guess, the biggest difference between the two defenses is that Denver's is healthy.
Yes. Obviously, Thomas Davis is planning to play, I suppose, the Super Bowl with a rod inserted in his forearm after breaking his arm in the championship game. And Jared
I don't know
Allen's
what that's
going to
be.
too.
Think about times you saw Jason Pierre-Paul this year try to tackle guys with one hand. What happens when you try to tackle essentially with one arm?
I can't imagine.
But I'm thinking more about the cornerbacks for Carolina because of the injuries to Tillman and Benwirke, that you're now playing McClain and Finnegan, and that's a big step down. Whereas with Denver, Chris Harris was pretty good against New England despite his injury, and he's had 2 weeks to get healthier. And from what I understand, the safeties who went out against New England are going to be healthy for this game too. So their defense is pretty healthy right now.
Yeah, for sure. It's kind of easy to see this becoming a low-scoring game all around. It's sort of hard to know for sure. The one thing that's sort of the complicating factor for the Broncos offense specifically is that they were fairly turnover prone throughout the season. They committed 31 turnovers, tied for third most in football. But the Panthers defense forced 39 turnovers this season, the most in football. I know a lot of sort of the advanced numbers will tell you that a lot of the turnover type of things can be deceptive, especially if one team is better at picking up loose fumbles, things like that. Those don't always sustain throughout the year. But I'm sure turnovers have to be a major concern for the Broncos, right?
Yeah, although, look, there are a couple of asterisks here. First of all, a lot of the turnovers are the one game against Kansas City. And I do think that given how Manning has played in the last 2 weeks, he has not, thrown a pick since he came in halfway through week 17, so the last 2.5 games, does not mean he's never going to throw a pick again or that he's suddenly back to being the old Peyton Manning of not throwing picks. But I do think that it suggests that the Kansas City game, where he threw like the 5 picks or whatever, is a little bit out of the norm.
Sure.
The other thing, of course, is that Carolina is going to have a ton of turnovers, takeaways, because they're winning all those games. And I think that some of that for Carolina is, it's the product of the poor schedule that they played. They did play the easiest schedule in the league this year. And the fact that those teams would be way behind a lot. So, it's like Jameis Winston just like, what the hell? Like, let's just throw it and hope something happens. As far as fumble recovery goes, Carolina recovered 48% of fumbles this year, Denver 56%. So both of those are pretty close to the norm. I don't think that the fumble recovery numbers make either team look better or worse than they really are in the standard stats.
So I had to search far and wide to find this, but I did find one player, James Jones of the Green Bay Packers, that said that he thought the Panthers defense was actually better than the Broncos defense. I actually just stumbled across this, I think, on NFL.com. But I thought it was an interesting comment for a couple of reasons. And one is he sort of focused on the speed of the Panthers defense. And it's definitely true that they're faster than a lot of teams with guys like Kuechly and Thomas Davis at the linebacker position that are just generally better at defending tight ends and working in coverage because of that speed. And I thought that might be specifically tied to their ability to force those turnovers. Is it possible that, and maybe they won't have Thomas Davis, but they have Shaq Thompson, a great athlete who's a rookie this season. Could players like that maybe have a better chance of forcing turnovers against Peyton Manning because basically they're making reads they think are open and they are open against other teams, but they just close so well?
I'll be honest, I've never studied it to find out whether the conventional wisdom about fast players creating more turnovers is true or not. I do know that what creates the most turnovers is pass pressure. First of all, pass pressure leads to picks. Second, pass pressure leads to tip balls, which might lead to picks. And third, and most importantly, it leads to sacks, and sacks lead to more fumbles, and fumbles on sacks have a high percentage chance of being recovered by the defense, as opposed to fumbles on runs or fumbles on aborted snaps, which is a high percentage for the offense. And because strip sack, the ball goes flying in some other direction. It's so the more pass pressure that Carolina can bring, the better things are going to be. The other thing about the defense being better for Carolina than it is for Denver is that no disrespect, but James Jones didn't have to play them without Tillman and Ben Wicare.
Yeah. And
for example, if you look at the charting stats from SIS for the cornerbacks, including the playoffs, McClain has a 48% success rate in coverage, and that's the lowest of any cornerback from either of these two teams. He's the only cornerback on either of these two teams below 50%. And I think it's very clear when you watch both Seattle's comeback and Arizona's desperate attempts to try to move the ball that both quarterbacks were like, either it's a zone and we'll take advantage of that, or find McClain and go after him.
Pretty much.
Not Finnegan.
No.
Not Finnegan. Finnegan has played well. Surprisingly well. McClain, it's like find him and just, where's Norman? Don't go there. Find McClain, go there. So if I'm Peyton Manning, it's like find McClain, go there. If it's Thomas, go to Thomas. If it's Sanders, go to Sanders. The problem is, can he, A, get the ball downfield with enough velocity that it's not hanging up in the air, and B, not get sacked?
Let me take a quick break to mention again that the Off the Charts Football Podcast is presented to you by FantasyInsiders.com, your source for daily fantasy sports content. Their slogan is Accuracy Matters, and it shows since they've won the daily fantasy accuracy competition for the past 3 years. If you're serious about DFS or want to become serious, check out FantasyInsiders.com for free educational content and premium memberships. Aaron, I didn't want to just drown us and spend 45 minutes talking about only two teams when we're normally talking about a little bit more in a given week. But are there any other topics that you think are relevant to this game that we should talk about?
I think that it's, I think the biggest thing here is sort of this feeling of the Denver defense is so good. The thing that people were not respecting enough before the AFC Championship game, that some people may still not realize how good they are, and other people may not realize that Carolina's defense was also really, really good, like this year.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I mean, there isn't a big special teams issue going on in this game at all. I don't think there's that much difference between these two teams on that. I'm not expecting big special teams plays. The only real, I guess, significant difference is that Denver's much better punting than Carolina is, and in a defensive battle that will matter for field position. But I mean, I'm expecting a low-scoring game.
Well, I mean, it's probably going to give me a heart attack, but I'm going to watch, and I'm going to look forward to watching it in any case.
I mean, the thing about the heart attack is this. You've got to try to remember it like an analyst, which is they're the better team, but that still only gives them like a 60% chance to win. I haven't seen any analytical folks out there who come up with, probabilities who have Carolina any higher than 60, 65%. I think we have it at 60.5. I think 538 has it at 59. It's just a thing where that's just football, man.
Yeah, right.
People forget that upsets, it's a sport where upsets happen a lot, in part because we're only looking at one game. In baseball, when two teams go to the World Series and the better team wins 4 out of 5, you're like, oh yeah, they won 4 out of 5, but they lost that one. So, here in this game, that one could be this game. But it's going to be good. It's going to be close because I think a more defense-oriented game has a better chance of being close than a real offense-oriented game, and that in some ways favors the Broncos. And both defenses are really good at coverage, and both defenses were in the top 10 in the league in fewest broken tackles. So, defense.
Well, I think that about wraps it up for both this podcast and for this season. Aaron, thanks again for being on this podcast every week. You were extremely insightful, and I love being a co-host with you. We just sort of started talking about this before the show, so we don't have full details, but it's possible that we'll be doing some off-season shows at key times, maybe around the draft or after the Football Outsiders Almanac's released. So everyone that's a fan, I encourage you to keep a track of footballoutsiders.com, where any posting will be. You can find notifications there, or you can check us out on Twitter. We'll tweet if we were sending out a new podcast one way or the other. And otherwise, I think that's it, Aaron. I'll be having a heart attack on Sunday. I hope you have a more casual and enjoyable Super Bowl experience than me, but hopefully we'll both be happy when it's all said and done.
I wish you good luck, because I'd like to see your team win, because I like to see teams that have never won win for the first time if my team can't win, and because I like to be right, and I picked Carolina, and so I hope your team wins, and I hope there are many field goals. Because ESPN asked us to predict. I hate predicting scores, but they asked for a prediction. I believe that my prediction was like 24-19.
Oh, that's awesome.
Denver having 4 field goals. So here's to a Carolina win with lots of field goals and no power outages.
Hear, hear. Thanks so much, Aaron, and thanks to all of our subscribers. We'll catch you either this offseason or next year.